Over 23,000 tons of bombs, more than 30,000 combat missions, 1,000 consecutive nights of terror. And the German soldiers who survived would never forget the sound, or rather the silence that came before the fire. They called them Nachthexen, the night witches. What they couldn't believe, what shattered their pride and haunted their sleep, was that the pilots tormenting them weren't hardened men. They were women. Young women. Soviet women who turned wooden biplanes into weapons of psychological warfare and flew into history as one of the most feared units of World War II. This is their story. The night falls heavy over the Eastern Front in the winter of 1942. Snow blankets the frozen earth, and the German encampments stretch across the Soviet landscape like scars. Soldiers huddle around dim fires, their breath visible in the icy air. The front has been brutal, but tonight there's something else in the air. A tension that creeps along the spine, a nervousness that no amount of training can suppress. Then, faintly, it begins. A hum, low, rhythmic, almost like the buzz of an insect. The soldiers glance upward, straining to see through the darkness. The hum grows louder, closer. And then silence. Complete eerie silence. For a few seconds, nothing. Just the wind. Then the bombs fall. Explosions rip through the night, tearing apart supply depots, ammunition stores, command tents. Flames leap into the sky, casting wild shadows across the snow. Soldiers scramble, shouting orders, firing blindly into the blackness above. But the enemy is already gone, swallowed back into the dark, leaving only destruction and confusion in their wake. This scene repeats. Night after night after night. The Germans begin to dread the sunset. They post extra sentries. They install searchlights and anti-aircraft guns. They try everything to stop the attacks. But the planes keep coming, silent, deadly, relentless. The soldiers start whispering a name, half in disbelief, half in terror. Nachthexen, night witches. Rumor spreads through the ranks. These aren't ordinary pilots. They fly without parachutes. They glide without engines. And worst of all, they're women. Young Soviet women who somehow, impossibly, have become the most persistent torment on the Eastern Front. For the battle-hardened Wehrmacht, men who believed they were the superior fighting force in the world, this was incomprehensible. How could women, girls really, some barely out of their teens, be doing this to them? It wasn't just the bombs. It was the humiliation. It was the fear that crept into their bones every time the sun went down. Because no matter how many they shot at, no matter how many searchlights they aimed into the sky, the night witches always returned. But who were these women? Where did they come from? And how did they become one of the most effective and feared units in the Soviet Air Force? The answer begins in October 1941, in the chaos and desperation of a nation on the brink of collapse. Nazi forces have torn through Soviet defenses, advancing deeper into the heartland with terrifying speed. Cities burn, millions flee. The Red Army is reeling, bleeding, desperately trying to hold the line. Joseph Stalin knows he needs every resource, every weapon, every possible advantage. And then an idea arrives, one that will change the course of the war in ways no one could predict. Her name is Marina Raskova, and she is already a legend. A record-breaking aviator, a national hero. She had captured the Soviet imagination years before the war by piloting long-distance flights that pushed the boundaries of what women were thought capable of. She was a navigator, an instructor, and a symbol. And now, in the darkest hour, she comes to Stalin with a proposal. Let women fight. Not as medics or support staff, but as pilots. Combat pilots, it's an audacious request. The Soviet Union, for all its rhetoric of equality, still operates under deeply traditional assumptions about gender and war. Women are mothers, workers, nurses, not warriors in the sky. But Raskova is persuasive and Stalin is pragmatic. The motherland is bleeding. If women can fly, if they can fight, then let them. On October 8, 1941, Stalin signs Order No. 0099, authorizing the formation of 3 all-female aviation regiments. The announcement sends a shockwave across the Soviet Union. From Moscow to the steppes of Kazakhstan, from Leningrad to the Caucasus, young women flood recruitment centers. They come from universities and factories, from farms and flight clubs. Some are trained pilots, most are not. But they all share something: a burning desire to defend their homeland, to strike back against the invaders who have taken everything from them. Among them is Nadezhda Popova, a teenager who watched the Nazis destroy her hometown. There's Yevdokia Bershanskaya, a seasoned pilot who will become the only woman to command a unit throughout the entire war. There's Irina Sebrova, who will fly more combat missions than almost any other pilot in history. These women and hundreds like them answer the call, knowing full well that many of them will never come home. They are not motivated by glory or propaganda. They are motivated by survival, by rage, by love for a country that is being torn apart before their eyes. And they are willing to risk everything. In early 1942, the recruits arrive at the training base in Engels, a small town on the Volga River. They are excited, determined, ready to prove themselves. What they find instead is skepticism, mockery, and equipment that seems designed for failure. The male instructors greet them with open disdain. Women pilots in combat? It's absurd. They'll wash out in weeks. The uniforms issued to the recruits are men's sizes, boots so large they have to stuff them with newspapers, pants that hang loosely, jackets that drown their frames. There are no facilities for women, no separate barracks. They sleep on floors, make do with what they have, and endure constant ridicule. Many of these young women have never even driven a car, let alone flown a plane. They come from small villages where the sky was just the sky, not a battlefield. But under Raskova's leadership, they begin to learn. They study navigation by candlelight. They memorize aircraft mechanics. They practice bombing runs on makeshift targets in the snow. The training is brutal, physically exhausting, mentally grueling, and compressed into a timeline far shorter than normal because the front needs them now. What begins as a group of uncertain recruits slowly transforms into something else. Bonds form in the cold nights and shared hardships. They become sisters, not by blood but by choice and circumstance. They learn to trust each other completely, because soon their lives will depend on it. The male pilots who once mocked them start to notice something. These women are serious. They're skilled. They're fearless in ways that defy expectation. And when the orders finally come to deploy to the front, the women of the 588th Night Bomber Regiment are ready. But they still don't know what awaits them. They don't yet know that they'll be flying in planes so outdated, so fragile, that German fighter pilots will consider shooting them down beneath their dignity. They don't yet know that those same fragile planes will become their greatest weapon. The Polikarpov Po-2. If you saw it in a museum, you'd assume it belonged in the history of early aviation, a relic from a simpler time, a biplane, constructed of plywood and canvas with an open cockpit and a maximum speed barely over 90 miles per hour. By 1942 it was obsolete. Designed in the 1920s as a crop duster and training aircraft, it had no place in modern aerial combat, and yet the Night Witches made it legendary. When the women of the 588th arrived at the front and saw their planes for the first time, some were shocked. This was what they were supposed to fight with. These fragile, slow, unarmed relics. There were no radios, no guns mounted on the aircraft, no parachutes for the crew. The bomb capacity was minimal, often just 2 bombs per flight. It seemed impossible, but Marina Raskova and Commander Yevdokia Bershanskaya saw what others didn't. The Po-2's weaknesses were also its strengths. It was slow, yes, but that made it nearly impossible for fast German fighters to engage without stalling. It was made of wood and fabric, but that made it almost invisible to radar. And most importantly, it was quiet. The women developed a tactic that would become their signature. They would fly in groups of 3. As they approached a target, the lead plane would throttle down, cutting the engine to near idle. In the silence, with only the wind whispering through the canvas wings, the plane would glide over the target. The pilot would release the bombs, then restart the engine and climb away into the darkness. Meanwhile, the second and third planes would draw the searchlights and anti-aircraft fire, creating a diversion. The Germans, hearing only a soft rustling sound before the bombs hit, were utterly unnerved. It was like being attacked by ghosts. The eerie, almost supernatural quality of the attacks gave rise to the nickname Nachthexen, the Night Witches. German commanders even issued orders offering awards to any pilot who could shoot one down, because the humiliation was becoming unbearable. The Night Witches flew at low altitudes, often just above treetop level, navigating by landmarks barely visible in the dark. The navigator sat in the rear cockpit with a stopwatch, a map and a flashlight, calculating bombing trajectories by hand while freezing wind tore at her face. The pilot gripped the stick with fingers numbed by cold, guiding the fragile plane through flak bursts and searchlight beams, and they did this not once, but many times a night. A single crew might fly 10, 12, even 18 sorties between dusk and dawn. They would land, refuel, load more bombs, and take off again. There was no rest, no relief, just mission after mission after mission, while exhaustion clawed at their bodies and fear whispered in their minds. The first raids are met with disbelief. German soldiers, hearing the distant hum of engines, prepare for a standard air attack. But when the bombs fall from the silent darkness, confusion spreads. Who is attacking? Where are they? The searchlights sweep the sky frantically, catching glimpses of small, flimsy-looking biplanes that seem impossibly vulnerable, and yet impossible to stop. Reports filter back to German command. Some officers laugh. Women pilots? Flying old training planes. It must be propaganda, a desperate Soviet ploy to boost morale. But as the attacks continue, night after night, week after week, the laughter dies. Supply depots burn. Ammunition stores explode, command posts are destroyed, and the attacks never stop. The night witches target everything. Fuel dumps, artillery positions, troop concentrations, bridges. They are relentless, methodical, and utterly fearless. Their planes may be slow and fragile, but they are also nimble and nearly impossible to track. German fighters, designed to intercept fast bombers at high altitude, struggle to engage the low-flying PO-2s. Attempting to slow down to match the biplane's speed risks, stalling and crashing, anti-aircraft fire becomes the primary threat, and the night sky over the Eastern Front fills with tracer rounds and exploding shells. But the women adapt. They learn to read the patterns of searchlights, to anticipate the bursts of flak, to twist and turn their fragile planes through the deadly net. And when they return to base, often with bullet holes in the canvas and shrapnel scars in the wood, they patch their planes and prepare to fly again. What the Germans slowly begin to realize, and what terrifies them, is that this isn't a short-term tactic. This is a sustained campaign. The women aren't going away. And night after night, the fear grows. 1,000 nights. That's how long the Night Witches flew combat missions. From 1942 to 1945, through the frozen hell of Russian winters and the grinding battles of the Eastern Front, they took to the skies every single night the weather allowed. Historians estimate they flew over 30,000 sorties, individual combat missions, and dropped more than 23,000 tons of bombs on enemy positions. Let that sink in. 30,000 missions, in planes made of wood and canvas, without parachutes, often without weapons for self-defense, navigating by landmarks in the pitch-black night with only a stopwatch and a map. The physical toll was staggering. Pilots and navigators flew in open cockpits, exposed to wind and cold that could reach 40 degrees below zero. Frostbite was common. Exhaustion was a constant companion. Many flew so many missions in a single night that they could barely climb out of their cockpits at dawn, their bodies stiff and trembling. But the psychological toll was even greater. Every time they took off, they knew there was a chance they wouldn't come back. Anti-aircraft fire tore through the night. Searchlights pinned them like insects under a magnifying glass. German night fighters prowled the darkness, hunting for any sign of movement. And yet they flew. Nadezhda Popova once described a mission where her plane was hit by flak and caught fire. Flames licked at the canvas wings as she fought to keep control, diving toward the ground in a desperate attempt to extinguish the fire through sheer speed. She survived, but the navigator in the back seat had to beat out flames with her bare hands. Yevdokia Bershanskaya, the regiment commander, flew alongside her pilots, leading by example. She never asked them to do anything she wouldn't do herself. Under her command, the 588th became the most decorated female unit in the Soviet Air Force. Irina Sebrova flew more missions than almost anyone, over 1,000 individual sorties. She survived the war but carried the memories with her forever. When interviewed decades later, she spoke not of glory but of fear, exhaustion, and an unshakable sense of duty. These women fought not just the enemy, but the cold indifference of a military establishment that often failed to recognize their contributions. Male pilots received better planes, better equipment, better rations. The women made do with what they had, proving again and again that courage and skill mattered more than resources, and the effect on German morale was devastating. Night after night, the bombs fell. Sleep became a luxury the Germans couldn't afford. Entire units became sleep-deprived, paranoid, jumpy. The mere sound of a distant engine was enough to send soldiers diving for cover. They were heroes, but their stories were often told in whispers. 23 women of the 508th Night Bomber Regiment were awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest honor the country could bestow. But many others received no recognition at all. Their names were lost, their sacrifices forgotten in the grand narrative of male-dominated warfare. Nadezhda Popova survived the war and flew 852 combat missions. She met her husband, also a pilot, during the war, and they remained together for the rest of their lives. But she rarely spoke of her service. The memories were too heavy, the losses too painful. Yekaterina Budanova, one of the most skilled fighter pilots in the Soviet Air Force, was shot down and killed in 1943. She had 11 confirmed kills, making her one of the top female aces of the war. Her body wasn't recovered for decades. Yevdokia Bershanskaya led the 508th through the entire war without being replaced, a rarity in the brutal calculus of the Eastern Front. After the war, she faded into obscurity, her achievements overshadowed by male generals and heroes. The women returned home to a country that didn't quite know what to do with them. Soviet propaganda had celebrated them during the war, but afterward, traditional gender roles reasserted themselves. Many were encouraged to return to normal life, marriage, children, quiet domesticity. Their military service was acknowledged, but not celebrated. Not truly. For decades, the Night Witches remained a footnote. Western historians rarely mentioned them. Soviet histories mentioned them briefly, if at all. It was as if the world wanted to forget that women had flown into combat, had faced death, had terrified the enemy, but their legacy endured. The women who survived carried the memory of their fallen sisters, and slowly, as the decades passed, their story began to resurface. Books were written, documentaries were made, survivors were interviewed, and a new generation learned about the women who flew into the night and made the Nazis tremble. In the German trenches, fear took many forms. But by 1943, one fear eclipsed all others when the sun went down: the Night Witches. German soldiers developed superstitions. Some refused to light cigarettes after dark, convinced the faint glow would attract a bombing run. Others slept with their helmets on, hands gripping their rifles, eyes darting toward every sound. Sentries stood watch with a dread that no amount of training could suppress, because they knew that when the attacks came, there was almost nothing they could do. Intelligence reports sent back to German command painted a picture of bewilderment and frustration. How were these women able to evade sophisticated air defenses? How were they flying so many missions without being intercepted? The answer was as simple as it was infuriating. The women were better at psychological warfare than anyone had anticipated. One captured German officer, interrogated by Soviet forces, admitted that the Night Witches had become a symbol of the Eastern Front's nightmare. "We didn't fear them because they were women," he reportedly said. "We feared them because they were ghosts." Nazi propaganda tried to dismiss them as a Soviet fabrication, a morale-boosting myth. But the soldiers on the ground knew better. They had seen the bombs fall. They had watched their comrades die. They had heard the eerie whisper of canvas wings gliding overhead in the dark. For the Wehrmacht, being bombed by women was an unbearable humiliation. It contradicted everything they believed about gender, about strength, about the natural order. And yet, night after night, these women made fools of them. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. Sleep deprivation eroded discipline. Paranoia spread. Morale, already fragile under the relentless Soviet counteroffensives, cracked further. The Night Witches didn't just destroy supplies and equipment, they destroyed confidence. On May 9, 1945, the war in Europe ended. The guns fell silent, the fires burned out, and the Night Witches, exhausted but unbroken, landed their planes for the final time. Over the course of the war, they had flown more than 30,000 combat missions, more than any other female unit in history. They had dropped over 23,000 tons of bombs on enemy positions. They had destroyed supply lines, disrupted communications, and terrorized one of the most powerful militaries the world had ever seen. And they had done it all in planes made of wood and canvas, flying without parachutes, navigating by starlight. 23 women received the Hero of the Soviet Union award. 30 were killed in action. Countless others were wounded, physically and emotionally scarred by the horrors they had witnessed. And then, as quickly as they had been celebrated, they were forgotten. Post-war Soviet society had little room for women warriors. The propaganda machine that had glorified them during the conflict now quietly pushed them aside. They were expected to return to traditional roles, to marry, to raise children, to rebuild the country in silence. Their uniforms were packed away. Their medals were placed in drawers. Their stories were left untold. For decades, the Night Witches existed only in fading memories and dusty archives. Western historians barely acknowledged them. Soviet historians mentioned them in passing, if at all. It was as if the world had decided that women in combat was an anomaly, an aberration best left in the past. But history has a way of resurfacing. In the 1980s and 1990s, as the Soviet Union began to open up and glasnost allowed for more honest reflections on the past, the stories of the Night Witches began to emerge. Survivors were interviewed. Documents were declassified. And slowly the world began to learn the truth. Today, the Night Witches are recognized as one of the most remarkable military units in history. Their story is taught in schools, celebrated in books and films, honored in memorials. But more than that, they stand as a testament to courage, resilience, and the power of determination in the face of overwhelming odds. They were young women who should have been living ordinary lives, studying, working, falling in love, raising families. Instead, they chose to fly into the darkness, knowing that every mission might be their last. They fought not for glory but for survival, not for recognition but for the future of their homeland. And they won. The Night Witches proved that courage has no gender, that ingenuity can overcome technological disadvantage, that even in the darkest nights, when the enemy seems invincible, a small group of determined individuals can change the course of history. So the next time you hear a story about heroes, about warriors, about the impossible made possible, remember the Night Witches. Remember the women who flew into the night and made the Nazis tremble. Remember the silent wings, the whispered wind, the bombs that fell from the darkness. And remember that they did it for over 1,000 nights, without parachutes, without fear, without ever giving up, because that's what heroes do.